Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. So a lot of people think about getting strong, and they think that one of the best ways to do that is to potentially pull out all of their conditioning work in order to focus on absolute strength or hypertrophy, since there's kind of a general assumption that if you are doing conditioning, that you're going to limit your ability to get stronger, which there may be some truth to that, and there may be some good reasons to potentially stop doing as much conditioning in order to focus on getting stronger. But I see a lot of people try to do something like this and have potentially negative results, especially relative to competing in CrossFit as a sport, right? Trying to get better at something like 19.2 with heavy squat cleans and toes to bar. I'm thinking that, okay, I need to get my squat clean up, so I'm going to focus on only weightlifting for a while. I'm going to stop doing my rowing intervals, and I'm just going to get my max squat clean up, and then that's going to result in me being able to get through the barbell at 275 or 155 or whatever. And in a lot of cases, that doesn't actually turn out particularly well as far as results in the sport of CrossFit. So we wanted to sort of run through, why people might want to potentially pull out conditioning, why that might not be actually as good of an idea as they think it is, and the ways that people should think about the balance between strength work and conditioning in a training program. So, John, what are potentially good reasons, or, like the thought processes behind why someone would attempt to pull out all their conditioning work in their training program?
I mean, really, it just comes down to getting the most out of the strength work. You look at potentially like a power lifter or a weightlifter who their sole focus is to be stronger. They are not working on their conditioning in any sense. Now, sure, it's slightly different because they have no conditioning work requirements within their sports. But their sole objective is to get strong, and they don't diversify their training outside of that. They purely focus on that strength work, and I think you have the potential to see better results when you're not wasting energy or burning your CNS or using up calories or things like that, doing work outside of strength.
I do also think that it's not totally true, though, that high level strength athletes don't do conditioning, right? I mean, everyone knows that the Westside Barbell folks drag sleds for like 6 hours per week. If at international weightlifting competitions, some of the athletes from China have been known to be going on like long jogs as a warm up, right? Which to some people is like, what are you doing? Like, you're destroying all your gains by running. But it's like, these people are able to handle a variety of different work and still get stronger. And in some cases, it may even benefit them to build their conditioning in order to be able to do more volume in their training sessions.
But you can look at that for like the Chinese weightlifters. They're not going on a run to work on their conditioning. That's kind of a loosener warm-up type thing. You look at Westside doing sleds. It's like, okay, are they doing power work? Are they doing strength endurance work to allow them to work on their strength a little bit better? It's not, I wouldn't classify that as conditioning per se, in the sense that we look at it within the CrossFit realm. CrossFit realm? Yeah. Can we say CrossFit realm? Is that all right?
I think it's kind of weird, but it's okay.
It's kind of Lord of the Ringsy, but yeah.
Yeah, there's a king of sorts, right? The king of the CrossFit realm, Greg Glassman. Castro has some sort of dark prince vibes. All good.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
But so, I mean, anyway, that people are potentially doing some conditioning, but it's not the same thing as like, okay, I want to actually get better at my 5K row time or my, 10 minutes of thrusters and double unders time or something like that is sort of what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when you look at, for some athletes who, one of the reasons that they struggle with strength is that they're just small. They don't have a lot of muscle mass. They're not a big athlete. And not saying you have to be big to be strong, but having more muscle mass helps with that. And when you look into like hypertrophy training, again, wasting the calories that you're eating on conditioning pieces is going to have I would say, a less optimal effect on hypertrophy. Not to say you can't gain muscle while you do conditioning, but if you were to focus solely on hypertrophy work without conditioning, you have a better chance of gaining muscle.
Yeah, that there's sort of like a diminishing returns on the amount of energy that you take in and where you're actually devoting that as far as like building muscle, which is very difficult for people to actually do, right?
Yeah.
That a lot of people will potentially gain muscle when they start doing some sort of structured strength program, especially if they haven't before. But then once you kind of hit like a set point for you, that it's very, very challenging to continue to add quote unquote lean mass.
Yep. Yeah.
So something else that I think is potentially relevant is the idea of like an off season. So a lot of folks will attempt to focus on strength work during their off season, meaning that they're not doing, CrossFit like stuff. They're not doing as much power cleaning and running around the block as they might during a like an in-season training program. They're not doing as many burpees, all that kind of stuff, which I actually do think it's a pretty good idea to have an off season, right? To sort of take some time away from the stresses of like high intensity CrossFit work and doing the same movement patterns over and over again. So there is value in having a time period in a yearly training block where you're not just doing the same stuff and you're actually getting some variation in the movement patterns and the intensity that you're doing. So I do think that that's a good idea as well. So, it's not like people need to be doing CrossFit stuff or testing open workouts all year. And it can potentially be a good idea to take some time and say, all right, great, we're going to, just do some simpler work with some more difficult contractions for this 6-week period, just to kind of like give you a break from all the shit kicking that people go through to actually get prepared for qualifying for something or, trying to do well in the open, or honestly, just like the day in, day out of class-based training as well at a lot of facilities, where it's kind of a balance of like, okay, how many difficult workouts can we have these people do per week to kind of keep them engaged and chomping at the bit to come in. So, I mean, there are potentially good reasons for people to focus on strength, right? I mean, the other thing that we didn't even really mention is just that like a lot of people potentially do need to get stronger in order to play at the level that they want to play at. Right. That, and we talked about this before where, people will think that potentially improving their squat clean is going to make them better at toes to bar and heavy squat cleans. And in some cases, it might actually do that, right? For a lot of people, it's not necessarily their 1 rep max that's the limiting factor in terms of them progressing into another round in a workout like that. It's their ability to repeat like a moderately challenging weight under certain types of muscle endurance fatigue, as well as just like global fatigue. But for some people, if you want to be able to get to the 275 pound bar and you're a male athlete and you can't squat clean 300 pounds, like you're probably going to have a hard time. Right. There are certainly people who can hit a few reps at 275 in a workout like that, whose squat clean is under 300, but that's definitely the exception. That, if you do want to get to that bar and you want to get a rep or two, like, well, you probably need to be able to squat clean about 300. If you want to get to the 225 pound bar, you probably better be able to squat clean about 250, right? So for those folks, it can also make sense for them to sort of have in their head, hey, you know what, maybe my priority in order to be able to complete these workouts as prescribed or to potentially, compete in a local competition or do something at a level, just above where I'm at, that strength may be the factor that is most limiting to them in order for them to even sort of like step on the floor and compete at a certain level.
Yeah. And it's going back to what you were saying about people needing that break. I find with the higher level athletes, the higher level they are, the more they can get away with less of a break to an extent. And it does depend on what they've done through the season. If they went through last year and went to like 4 different sanctioned events and, were doing qualifiers all the time, yeah, they definitely need a break. For those that maybe just did 1 qualifier, it's like we need to adapt the training to an extent to take that kind of off season. But I look at people that maybe they're in their off season right now for CrossFit and they're trying to get stronger. Well, I'm maybe going to have them cut down to doing like 2 maybe 3 kind of CrossFit workouts a week. There's going to be more aerobic work, obviously, but those CrossFit type workouts are going to be much more directed towards what their focus is in the off season. So if they're trying to get stronger, I'm having them do, Metcons with heavy barbells, and maybe it's kind of a short work, longer rest type workout. where I'm having them do, guys doing clean and jerks for reps at 225. Something that's really trying to build that consistency at higher percentages. Again, stuff we've talked about in the past about that 1 rep max not being the be all and end all. But if we can build someone up to be able to handle 90% of their max within a workout and repeat it, then they're going to be in a much better position.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, we've talked about some potentially good reasons for people to focus on strength and maybe even pull out some conditioning to do that. But, I mean, as we sort of introed, we generally don't think that this is a great idea to stop working on conditioning. And there's a few reasons for that, right? So one is essentially that CrossFit as a sport rarely looks like strength training. Right, that in most qualifying events for something, or most weekend competitions, or most sanctional events or whatever, that there might only really be one event that has any sort of maximal contraction in it. And a lot of times there isn't even that. There's some sort of heavy barbell based event to sort of like quote unquote test strength, but you usually have to do something else to get there, right? Everyone's familiar with the open workouts where you have to go through a bunch of different heavy barbells increasing in weight, or you might have to do a bunch of other shit that makes you tired before you get to test some sort of 1 rep max. So very rarely is there an actual piece that looks like, 3x5 back squat, 2-0 X1 tempo, rest 2 to 3 minutes in between, top set challenging for today, right? Like it's just not part of the competition. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do that in training, but the competitive events very rarely have a significant amount of scoring that is going to be directly tied to someone's strength numbers. And so if we're attempting to train for a sport, what we want to think about is, okay, what do we need to do as sort of like accessory work for the sport specific training that we're going to do? So, if we think about a strength training program for a CrossFit athlete whose goal, again, is to either, improve their standing in the open or to be able to do all the workouts as prescribed in their classes and beat their friends, or even to qualify for sanctionals, that individual is essentially, they're doing sport specific training, which is the equivalent of like soccer practice and like scrimmaging and playing games. And then they're also doing some general physical preparedness to make sure that they're able to do that sport specific training. So we want to think about the type of strength training that is going to result in improvement in that sport specific performance for that athlete, and that simply taking out conditioning doesn't actually give us the ability to kind of integrate the ability to lift heavy barbells in a conditioning environment, right? So like we talked about, we want to have all of the different skills that someone is working on integrated into the ability to do it under fatigue. So we want to think about, all right, great. We want you doing heavy squat cleans, but we want that ability to be integrated into the ability to do it when you're, gassed from rowing 500 meters at a tough pace ahead of time, or that your grip is shot when you've done too many toes to bar and double unders, and now you need to be able to hang onto the barbell to pull it off the floor. So, just simply pulling out conditioning can result in this kind of like isolated strength adaptation that doesn't then carry over into the things that we want to do. So I see that happen for a lot of folks who do potentially take out their conditioning work, get a lot stronger, and then when they go back and are like, great, I'm way stronger now, let's see if that improves my performance on 19.2, that it just doesn't, because even though their 1 rep max went up, they actually got worse at the ability to do moderately heavy to heavy squat cleans under fatigue.
Yeah. And I think kind of what you touched on there, with regards to how people kind of it's not a sport strength, or it's not a strength sport, sorry, that for a lot of people, it's rare that their limiting factor is just strength. Like, sure, there are a lot of people that need to be stronger to be able to perform at the level they want to, but it's very rare that everything else within their game is at the level it needs to be at. So even if you wanted to focus on just strength, you're almost guaranteed to be missing out on things that needed to be worked on as well. I can't think of really anyone that I know of that if they added 50 pounds to their squat clean would be at the games. Like it doesn't work. There's too many other things to be focused on there.
Yeah, and there's a difference as well between some athletes who, when they get stronger, that does seem to improve their, we'll call it like battery ability, and those who don't, right? So I think that some athletes who do tend to be kind of like grindier and maybe don't always have the best 1 rep max relative to the people who they're competing with in the sport will actually see that translation of like, okay, your 1 rep max went up, and that means that your 30 squat cleans for time at a high percentage went up. Whereas for other athletes, those are just totally decoupled. It doesn't track together.
Yeah.
So I think the other thing that's potentially confusing to people is that there's a sort of like general conception that you can't necessarily adapt to strength training and conditioning at the same time. And most people who are in the CrossFit sphere have seen this just like not play out in their own training and the training of those around them, that they've seen people both get stronger and much more well conditioned by just doing a bunch of random shit all at the same time. So the sort of like conventional wisdom of like, oh, if you're doing conditioning, you're not getting stronger, just kind of doesn't fly. But there still is this general understanding that, again, if you're spending sort of like adaptation reserve on getting better at conditioning, that's adaptation reserve you're not spending on getting better at strength. And I do think that this is true, right? That the research on this is kind of confusing and a little bit all over the place, but essentially, in higher level athletes, if you are doing strength work and conditioning work at the same time, your adaptation to the strength work will probably be worse than if you just weren't doing the conditioning work. And the other side of that is true as well, that if you're doing strength work and conditioning work at the same time, that your adaptation to the conditioning is going to be a little bit worse than if you basically pulled out almost all of your strength work. So, there is some truth to that, but like we were talking about a second ago, that you are still able to integrate both of those things. And then when you do them together, you actually get a more robust adaptation that doesn't go away as much, right? So we've also seen people who potentially get a lot stronger by pulling out conditioning. Then when they go back and add it back in, they lose some of their strength adaptation. So it wasn't as robust of an adaptation. And it also doesn't necessarily carry over to their sport specific performance. So what we'd rather see is people doing both strength work and conditioning work at the same time, potentially losing some of the adaptation that they could have gotten in their just like absolute strength numbers or absolute conditioning numbers, but having a more robust adaptation that doesn't go away when they, switch their focus in their training cycle. And then also one that does integrate more into that sport specific training that we've been talking about.
I think you see that within competition within CrossFit as well. Like if you couldn't increase your strength while doing conditioning work, you wouldn't see people hit PRs at the games or at regionals, because no one is going to regionals having just worked on their strength in the prior 8 weeks before regionals. No one goes to the games just having focused on strength without any conditioning. Everyone's running, they're swimming, they're doing cycling, they're doing odd object training. That their training is so varied because they don't know what they're going to have to do. And then to see them go and hit like a PR mid competition, like that wouldn't happen if you couldn't improve strength while you're working on conditioning. It wouldn't take place. And
yeah, I think that. Go ahead, sir.
Sorry, it means there's either people are getting able to get stronger during conditioning, or the work they're doing in terms of the conditioning work is actually having a positive effect on their strength. And I think it's likely to be a combination. But.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, because just the pure volume of contractions that you're doing and a bunch of different planes of motion, and, especially for people who are at a high level who can just adapt to just like a bunch of different shit going on, that they are potentially just going to build adaptation across the board in all these different areas. But I do think there's a bit of a misconception as well in terms of the way people think about how strong they're going to get, right? So to your point, people all the time are setting PRs in situations where they quote unquote shouldn't be, right? They're not following a structured cycle, and then they end up hitting, a deadlift PR. They're at the end of some like crazy workout with a bunch of dumbbell front squats and bar facing burpees, and their legs are completely shot, and they somehow hit a clean PR. And you're like, why is that happening? That's sort of weird. That doesn't make any sense. And it's very clear that, and these are well-trained athletes too, right? These aren't people who are just like total noobs who were somehow able to, get an additional 20 pounds on the bar for a squat clean because they misloaded it and, everyone was cheering for them. Like, it's just not, that's not always the case. It's people who have, a 10-year plus training age with solid movement proficiency across the board, and who have, PRs that would put them in the 99.9th percentile of, everyone in the entire world. So it's not just like, oh yeah, like these are newbie training effects. But I do think that there's a difference between what is someone's absolute potential in, let's say, squatting or weightlifting, if they only focused on that, and what is their potential relative to where they're at right now, right? Mm-hmm. That a lot of these people who are setting these PRs in these contexts probably would be stronger if they stopped doing their conditioning stuff altogether, really focused on either powerlifting or weightlifting and weren't really doing CrossFit, quote unquote, that they would probably be stronger than they are now. But that said, they are able to still progress in their strength while doing CrossFit and a lot of conditioning based upon what we've been talking about. So, are we talking about like this individual's absolute potential, or are we talking about their potential relative to what they can do while still attempting to compete in a sport like CrossFit? I don't know if that made any sense.
Kind of. Yeah, I mean, as a coach, I've done it before where I've had athletes do just strength work. And it was kind of, off season and everyone needs to get stronger. And I was like, okay, let's try doing just strength work. We're not going to do any conditioning. Your sessions in the gym are going to be a lot shorter. It's just going to be lifting, strength, maybe a little power work in there. And yeah, sure, people get stronger, but the time you then have to spend rebuilding on the conditioning and rebuilding on like the CrossFit type metcons, which as much as it is conditioning, I still view it as kind of separate. There's a different kind of conditioning within that. But yeah, I think it digs you too much of a hole in other areas to be a viable training option. If you want to be a well-rounded athlete, it's not beneficial long-term. Beneficial for short-term strength, but not long-term performance.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, you just started to touch on this. So, I mean, if we're thinking about, okay, we have someone whose priority is increasing their strength, right? They need their squat to go up. They need their press to go up. They need their, max snatch to go up in order to, again, do workouts as prescribed, or potentially compete at a higher level than what they're competing at. So for this individual, I mean, as we talked about, we do want to be cognizant of how much of their training adaptation they're spending on conditioning, how much they're spending on strength. And we want to be cognizant also just like what is the total stress load of the conditioning work that we're adding in, and how does that impact this individual's strength work? So what do you think about that? Because we do want to pay attention to the ratio of conditioning to strength work, but we don't want to pull it out entirely. So how do you process that for your athletes?
Most of the time, I'll kind of identify what their strength deficiencies are. For the majority of people, it's going to fall into either pulling strength, squatting strength, or upper body pushing or pulling strength, or what I generally would just think of as like core bracing or connectional strength, which is a phrase I just made up on the spot. But what I mean by that is, you look at someone who can maybe front squat a pretty decent number, but can't clean very well. And it's not their squatting strength, it's not their pulling strength, it's their ability to maintain tension in the catch or whatever. But people kind of, identifying where their strength weaknesses lie, and then identifying which other CrossFit movements can work on that. So if I know someone's pretty poor with their pressing strength, maybe we're going to do pressing work 2 to 3 times a week in some capacity, whether it's overhead or horizontal. But maybe we're going to combine that with some gymnastics work. Maybe they're going to do some higher volume handstand push-ups. Maybe they're going to work on strict deficit handstand push-ups on the strength side of things. Maybe they're going to do high volume of ring muscle-ups to work the muscular endurance through the shoulders. So trying to find ways to couple the conditioning movements in with what the strength goals are going to be.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's, there are elements of potential interference and problems that we're going to have if we're doing too much conditioning relative to getting stronger. So, I mean, you're talking about being aware of like the ways that we want people to get stronger and attempting to include that stuff in their conditioning. But we also want to potentially avoid stuff in their conditioning that might impact their strength development, right? So, sure. I mean, if we're thinking about, okay, we're trying to really increase someone's squatting, in terms of their absolute strength, or even not their absolute strength, but just like their squatting repeatability in like a heavy barbell scenario, then we might want to be aware of how much squatting that individual is doing across the board in a training week or a training month. Yeah. Right. So if we're thinking about, great, like we're doing, these tempo back squats we talked about earlier, maybe we're doing some interval-based squat clean work, like every 15 seconds for a certain amount of time, you're going to do a squat clean that's kind of challenging. And then we might have a more like grinder-based conditioning piece with front squats at some point during the week. Then we're thinking about, okay, this individual is doing this much squatting per week. How much, additional squatting am I having them do by having them do goblet squats and wall balls and jump squats and jumping switch lunges and then rear foot elevated split squats and then another grinder with like heavy dumbbell box step overs. And that there does come a point where we're just overloading that person's capacity to adapt in all of these knee flexion movements. And then we are actually impacting their ability to get stronger. So that's certainly something that we need to be cognizant of.
Yeah. And I think in the balance of that, using different movement patterns to try and get the same end result can be useful as well. So like you're saying, you don't want to have too much squatting in terms of volume in a week when we're trying to improve that squat strength. Okay, maybe we're going to throw in some sled work in the conditioning where we can still work on kind of leg muscular endurance without focusing specifically on a full range of motion squat. And same through other muscle groups and movement patterns of just finding ways that we can not overload them in the same movement pattern and not take away from the strength gains, but still get some kind of development there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we also need to be aware of the intensity of conditioning, right? That it's very clear that people can adapt across the board in a lot of different scenarios. But again, if we're thinking about, okay, you have a finite amount of adaptation that you can get in a given period, if we're smoking you too often with like really, really challenging conditioning where you're, going to the well every Tuesday and Thursday in order to do an 18-minute AMRAP or like really nasty 30-second sprint intervals, that is potentially going to have more of an impact on someone's ability to get stronger than doing aerobic row intervals at a sustainable pace or, accumulating a certain amount of volume of running and ski erg at a sustainable pace, or even doing, like you mentioned before, some more like grindy stuff, like wall climbs and legless rope climbs and like moderately challenging Turkish get-ups. Like that might be something that someone can do without really smoking themselves in the same way that's going to actually impact their just overall training stress.
I mean, you say without smoking them completely. I wrote a workout recently that I had a couple of different people do that involved sets of 5 wall climbs and I think 6 Turkish get-ups, like 3 each side, just for a long kind of aerobic piece. I tried it, absolutely killed me.
Yeah, but are you in shape, John?
Hey, why you got to do that? Why do you have to bring that up? Unbelievable.
But I do think that is also something that's worth noting, that different athletes will respond differently in terms of like how they feel and how they recover from different types of training, right? So some people can just kind of do like grindy stuff like that forever. They can do a bunch of it and it's just always fine. And it may be difficult for them, but it doesn't actually impact them too much in terms of like day-to-day recovery or the amount of volume on a weekly basis. Mm-hmm. Whereas other people just kind of like can dig themselves a hole on something like that fries them in a way that doesn't necessarily make sense relative to how hard they should have worked during that. And similarly, other people can do, a lot of like rowing and wall balls and just sort of like be fine. And then other people will be smoked and super sore and kind of messed up from like digging deeper on a conditioning piece like that. So that's something else to be aware of, just as far as how athletes react individually to different types of stress.
Yeah, and I think that's where having that kind of individualized program is more beneficial because, I could give the same workout to 5 different people, and it's going to affect them all differently and affect the rest of their week differently, depending on what position they're at and how good they are at stuff.
Yeah. And we talked about the idea of having an off season earlier, which I think is important, right? So that this idea of maybe pulling out some of the sport specific work in order to focus on strength, or just like having fun in the gym, or, jumping in with some classes like that, that's all good. And that's a very reasonable thing to do. And that in general, if we do pull out some of that sport specific training, we might actually get more strength adaptation as well, just because we're pulling out some of that really, really high intensity stuff that can often smoke people. We're pulling out a lot of like very high, high volume shoulder contractions, where it's like, well, if you're preparing for the CrossFit Open, you have to do this many chest to bar pull-ups and this many muscle ups and this many strict handstand push-ups and this many feet of handstand walking and this many like moderate load thrusters. And then that's just like a lot of volume on someone's rotator cuffs, which may impact their ability to get better at snatching. So you can sometimes see, still working on a lot of conditioning through some maybe more like thoughtful and structured, planned out ways of improving stuff, and getting stronger at the same time. Whereas if someone is just kind of doing like a lot of different CrossFit shit constantly, that can be a little bit too chaotic for that individual to actually get stronger.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty important for a lot of people, that they don't realize, like they think they're having an off season, but in reality, they've just shifted how they're getting the volume and intensity in. They're actually still doing a high volume, high intensity, what I'd call in-season competition prep stuff, and they've just repackaged it, and they think they're kind of taking it easy on themselves when they're not. Like for my athletes who are, I would say, actually in an off season right now, where their focus is to compete at a high level next year. Right now, like the kind of stuff you see in the open, they're barely touching on. They maybe get one workout a week where it's kind of in that open range, where it's lighter weights, body weight movements, higher reps. But it's rare that they're going to do that kind of stuff in the off season. It's just right. That kind of stuff is easier to build at a later date if they've done the work in the off season. Yeah.
And I think that as well, that you can still include things that are similar enough to that without having too much of it. Because I've certainly made the error in the past of pulling out too much like sports specific stuff. And then people just kind of like it, that some of them lose it, that some people are just so talented at that if you just start giving them any of it, they adapt very quickly, whereas others are not. And you're like, okay, great. You're pretty good at CrossFit. Maybe we don't need to do as much. And then when you start adding it back in, you'll just pick it up again. And it's just not always the case, but it's, I mean, like we talked about, there's complexity in terms of adding in an appropriate amount of the sport specific training so that they don't lose that quote unquote like game speed or understanding of what that stuff feels like, and build kind of a bunch of like weird, random, isolated fitness traits that don't actually result in improved sport performance. But at the same time, like we've been talking about, you're also trying to make sure that the weekly training stress is focused on the things that we want them to get better at, and then we're not interfering too much by just throwing in like, yeah, cool, like try this workout with this many double unders in it or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that training stress across the week is sometimes missed by people, sometimes missed by coaches, where they don't quite work out how much the athlete can handle and how much they've given them. Or if, an athlete's kind of working on their own, how much work they're actually doing across a week. And they get, 5 weeks into their off season and they're just trashed and they don't understand why.
Yeah. So I think in terms of overall takeaways, to try to sort of distill some of the, it depends, and well, this case do this, in this case do that type of situation. I mean, overall, I would say that pulling out conditioning in order to focus on strength is not a good idea. That people can adapt to both strength and conditioning work at the same time. And if their goal is to get better at CrossFit as a sport, pretty much across the board, right? From sort of intermediate athletes trying to get a little bit better to advanced athletes trying to, beat people or qualify for something, that they're going to want to improve both their strength and conditioning at the same time. And if you isolate that too much, then you actually don't get the improved sport performance that you're looking for. And then in terms of balancing training stress, then what we want to think about is having some sort of structure to the season, where some period is clearly more of like a quote unquote off season, some period is clearly more, general physical preparedness, and some period is clearly more sport specific preparedness. And that you don't want to pull out conditioning, but you want to be cognizant of what kind of conditioning you're doing, how much stress it's creating for the athlete, and the types of contractions that are happening during that relative to what you expect from them as far as getting better at their strength work.
I would concur with like 89% of that.
Cool. Let's argue over the 11.
No, because I don't want you to cry again. No, I mean, I think that's a pretty good summation of the points.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.